Welcome to the film analysis, today with Oppenheimer by Christopher Nolan. Oppenheimer does not represent Nolan's most innovative film compared to Tenet, but his purest work. It reaches a tremendous height of style unseen in Nolan. One has never been able to experience such a biopic in cinema. In Interstellar, Nolan acts as an engineer who wants to know how something must be assembled to fly so that the mission can be fulfilled. In Oppenheimer, it remains mainly theory and political discourse. The art of engineering is now a discursive one, not produced by technical devices like planes, space shuttles or bombs. In fact, we hardly see the bombs at all. They are once taken away in two boxes and that's it, but Nolan works through editing alone. And he succeeds in acting as an engineer to create a cinema of faces. The film is based on the great Oppenheimer biography American Prometheus by K. Burt and Martin J. Sherwin. 600 pages about this very contradictory personality. It is first and foremost a collection of material. They talked to 100 people, rifled through thousands of pages in archives to form a coherent picture. But it keeps fraying. We are dealing with an additive structure. This book is impressive, but it also leaves one lost without clear stance. Or would it be possible to condense it? Now we no longer need the book, as Christopher Nolan creates this concentration. At the same time, the film owes everything to the book. You first must have this material to be able to process it, to achieve this composition with an outstanding leading actor at the center. Cillian Murphy plays Oppenheimer, who becomes the father of the atomic bomb, who tries to build the atomic bomb before the Nazis to end World War II and perhaps end all wars. The film follows two themes. Firstly, the responsibility of the scientist. Is it even permissible to build such a bomb? Can one foresee the consequences? And if you foresee them, can you continue to work? And secondly, the relationship of the citizen to the state. Oppenheimer supposes himself to be a citizen. He lends his talents to the state, but what does the state return? Is it grateful? The film is not chronological. We are in the 1950s at a backroom hearing. Oppenheimer is now to be declassified. He was supposed to have his security clearance revoked in the 1950s. He often appears in public and warns against further armament, warns against building a hydrogen bomb and so on. And now, in the conservative McCarthy era, they simply declare all those advocating a de-escalation of the Cold War to be communists and therefore the enemy. Oppenheimer is very indebted to Niels Bohr, even if briefly appearing in the film. Bohr stands up for disarmament as an admonisher, and Bohr also urges people to realize the only opportunity where this Pandora's box has already been opened remains in trying to find common cooperation so that armament does not continue to drive the world into the abyss. Transparency and openness would be the order of the day vis-à-vis the Soviets. As Oppenheimer also expresses these thoughts, he is declared an enemy and he is to be confronted with his left-wing past. He is accused of having been a member of the Communist Party. Oppenheimer is supposed to justify himself, and another set of scenes take place in the 1950s with the politician Louis Strauss, played by Robert Downey Jr., who had previously argued with Oppenheimer over the hydrogen bomb. He feels humiliated by Oppenheimer. Now he not only wants to advance his political career, but also wants to take revenge on Oppenheimer. But this Strauss is not only a schemer, but he also actually portrays Oppenheimer in a different light. For in fact, one can consider whether Oppenheimer is trying to wash away his sins in the 1950s. The film is a genre hybrid, a biopic, a war film, a political and scientific thriller, and it is a courtroom drama of the very highest order. A film relating to the 50s, 40s, 30s and 20s, but it does so by widely jumping back and forth in a way never seen before in cinema. Tenet taught us our problem relies on linearity. We can hardly anticipate the future, but when you build a nuclear bomb, you depend on being able to anticipate the consequences, at least mentally, so that you can ask yourself whether you should behave differently now. And because linearity stands in our way, Nolan follows a completely different aesthetic path than in Tenet. But in terms of structure, he remains true to the Tenet pattern, jumping widely back and forth between the times. Here, an attempt is made to anticipate something, to consider the consequences. Figures like Niels Bohr or Einstein appear because they are external, because they do not belong to the Manhattan Project, to make clear where the real dangers lie. Nolan shows us the world of atoms here, but also nature. Again and again, Oppenheimer rides out with his wife to great white American landscapes, but Nolan asks himself, can we still show such long shots, these holistic images? Because Oppenheimer himself no longer sees them. He has seen what holds the world together at its core, and he knows how to split it. And we see Oppenheimer entering the museum and standing in front of pictures of Cubism, pictures by Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso. Nolan says, I can tell a film non-linearly now. I certainly can't put Cubist images on the screen, but I also must find my form to show that everything falls apart, that something has been unleashed by Einstein's discovery. The classical representations are no longer possible, not even in cinema. And so Christopher Nolan opts for close-ups, for a cinema of faces. The camera slowly moves towards the faces until they appear in sculptural plasticity. No more long shots, but close-ups. In some scenes, the faces protrude beyond the screen into the cinema hall. At least that's how it seems. One can accuse Nolan of all this, of interlacing, but Nolan is not simply playing with the viewer. On the contrary, the crucial point is creating an Oppenheimer film requires an appropriate form. Well, the basis of the bombs is nuclear fission and nuclear fusion. Nolan now splits and fuses individual scenes. We see how a scene begins. Someone explains himself in a hearing, his sentence is abruptly interrupted, a time jump back to the 20s, then to the 30s, to the 40s, back to the hearing in the 50s, another interruption again somewhere, or we see interrupted scenes as far as the images are concerned, but the sound continues. So that's where we see this fusion. So it's fission and fusion, meaning it's cinema tremendously masterfully executed by Nolan. We jump back and forth in the 30s, 40s and 50s. We stay with the Manhattan Project for a long time and seen as a whole. And like a chain reaction, one scene follows logically from another, despite the non-chronological narrative. This represents also the fear of the chain reaction that one will trigger the one, that will trigger the other. For that is the big question arising: could an atomic bomb not only destroy a certain place, but set off a chain reaction that can no longer be stopped, whereby you would destroy everything, the whole world? The probability, they say, at some point is close to zero. But can you still take the risk? If there is such a risk. Einstein said one would have to tell even the Nazis what we are talking about here so that the Nazis would not even attempt such a bomb. The staccato form of Ludwig Göransson's music fits this splitting up. The notes are separated from each other and the strings cut through, dividing the characters, the scenes, and us viewers. This results in a special dramaturgy. Various arcs of tension are used. It's hard to keep them all in mind, but there is a very long arc of tension. There is General Leslie Groves, played by Matt Damon, who hires Oppenheimer for the Manhattan Project, and he too sits in a hearing in this back room in the 50s and is asked, would he hire Oppenheimer again? And we expect an answer immediately, of course, but this answer is first interrupted by flashbacks, indeed by half a film which takes place an hour long. The film interrupts itself, splits up, only to create this fusion again. And the greatest arc of tension is the one held from beginning to end. Einstein and Oppenheimer meet after the war. They stand by a pond and talk briefly. Shortly after, Einstein walks up and away quite sullenly. We only find out at the end what was said, and this resolution is so powerful in its casualness, resembling an explosion, a bomb. We have many little arcs of tension, Oppenheimer and his affair, the rivalries between the scientists, the suspicions to which Oppenheimer is permanently exposed. After all, he is considered a communist, or at least one who has too many contacts in the Communist Party, even though he always wants to make it clear that he is only concerned with fighting the fascists in Spain and speaking out in favor of the New Deal. We see the scenes of Oppenheimer from his perspective in color. The images in black and white, however, are meant to be more objective, as Nolan says himself. The black and white images show the other view of Oppenheimer, but by that, Nolan doesn't mean that these images are objective, but only that it's not this subjective view that Oppenheimer himself displays. And it is a very special black and white, rich in contrast. One almost has the impression that in some scenes one is dealing with X-ray photographs. One wants to penetrate to an innermost core here too, reminiscent of the black and white thinking of the McCarthy era. This film is full of stars. Every role is cast with a big star, but this is not star cinema, but a cinema of faces. So you don't even notice the stars as stars. Nolan inserts them into his aesthetic. The characters are functionaries. Who stands for what, and for whom are their characters changing their position? Who are great opportunists? The question that arises with Oppenheimer also arises with all the characters. What do they really stand for? What do they want? We can't really trust anyone. Matt Damon says in his role as general, I only trust myself because we only know ourselves and we don't know the others. Astonishingly, we zoom into these figures in the close-ups, but in a way we still cannot see behind them. Nolan works excellently with this uncertainty. It is also discourse cinema. Why is the bomb needed? Oppenheimer is only concerned with defeating the Nazis, but he learns it's also being used against the Japanese, and the US is already intending to use it against the Soviets or to upgrade it to be superior to the Soviets. Oppenheimer, together with Niels Bohr, had this idea that the sovereignty of individual nation states could be restricted by the bomb. a world government or the United Nations are needed. That is the hope, and these were the efforts in the post-war era trying to persuade Washington to declare the atomic bomb illegal like poison gas. And Oppenheimer shows himself to be a brilliant mind here, but he is naive. He is incapable of thinking about the political and social as much as Niels Bohr. Bohr already says during World War II, I didn't come here to help you, but to talk about the fact that in view of the existence of such a bomb, we don't need another bigger bomb, but a new world. Bohr hopes for the United Nations. The Oppenheimer film comes at the right moment. We witness spirals of escalation, chain reactions, how blocks are suddenly formed again, and how all those who warn against such block formation are suddenly to be cancelled, being portrayed as the enemy. That's exactly what happens to Oppenheimer and his comrades in arms. People investigate Oppenheimer, want to denounce him as a communist so that his voice is no longer heard in public and is no longer taken seriously. Oppenheimer is torn, and we don't know him even at the end of the film. We can only understand some things about him, including his escapism when he rides out again and again in Santa Fe to these western landscapes. Thereby Nolan adds another discourse to the film, namely the frontier thesis, the idea that you can always move on, that you can always conquer something. The frontier thesis by Frederick Jackson Turner established the idea of US exceptionalism. The Indians are dealt with in two ways. First, Indians are being driven out of Los Alamos for the Manhattan Project. At the same time, the conquest of the world of atoms sets in, potentially resulting in total annihilation. The conquest of the atoms by physics has even more fatal consequences than the ethnocide of the Indians. When Oppenheimer meets Truman after World War II, the former says we should hand Los Alamos back to the Indians. Critics accuse the film Oppenheimer of faking complexity. In the end, everything is simple. And that's exactly what Nolan is working with. Is the film in the end also very simple? Is the nesting necessary? Yes, certainly. To highlight it again at the end, it's about one or two big questions, and maybe also about the fact that they can be answered easily. We also see the private Robert J. Oppenheimer repeatedly, but that doesn't play the main role, as it didn't define him in his life, but he lived for the work. And he also says at one point, even when he and his wife leave their toddler with acquaintances because they don't really want to take care of their own child, don't have time for it, Oppenheimer says, we are terribly selfish people. Christopher Nolan, with all the abstract, the theoretical, creates a very central cinema, and central but in quite the frightening way. There is the atomic bomb test in Los Alamos. The music suddenly falls silent. We only hear the breathing of Oppenheimer and a few others. The fire ignites the entire screen, and instantly we realize why this Oppenheimer story belongs to cinema. Cinema which thrives on light, is made for modern Prometheus' story. These are incredibly spectacular films, shaking scenes. It is also physical cinema. When the bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we see nothing of that. It would have been possible to depict the events, or rather one would have to make a completely different film, maybe something like Hiroshima, Mon Amour. Nolan decides to stay in Los Alamos, but he still tries to deliver the explosions on screen, to render them tangible. And so Oppenheimer, who has now also just heard from the radio from Truman, yes, the bombs have fallen, is holding a speech in a sports hall. His team and many other employees in Los Alamos celebrates him as the great winner, as the hero. They look at it like it's a sports event. And in the biography, one reads that he appeared like an actor and said the Japanese won't have liked it. Big cheers. And then he says, I would have liked to have had the bomb before against the Nazis. Again, big cheers. But when we say he's an actor, is that really what he's thinking right now? Or is something else gnawing deep inside him, making the absolute turmoil clear? That's what Nolan shows us. In slow motion we see this vibrating crowd, cubism faces, shouting cheers, beside itself with joy in the faces of the successful bomb that is in the face of tens of thousands of dead. Suddenly this explosion comes into this hall and suddenly these faces become cracked, like in cubism. These faces are also torn apart by this atomic bomb. We get to see all this from Oppenheimer's point of view. Nolan merges both. The bomb explosions far away in Japan suddenly arrive directly at Oppenheimer and this triumphant crowd, blinded by victory. This is reminiscent of today's bellicose, lustful discourse. These people, Nolan tells us, do not match such a weapon. Too late does Oppenheimer realize that mentally immature people surround him, howling war cries, being self-absorbed. Yet the film does not pursue a cult of genius. The point is not to show that Oppenheimer really was the most brilliant of all time, but rather to put this very Oppenheimer figure into perspective with other great minds, Einstein, Niels Bohr and some other scientists who contradict Oppenheimer or know something better. The direct confrontations with the military and especially politicians underline that Oppenheimer is vastly superior to his superiors. These mediocre politicians suddenly have this superior weapon at their disposal. Philosopher Günther Anders dealt with this very issue. He addresses the atomic bomb and its dangers in the 1950s, as the title of his book says, The Nuclear Threat. And Günther Anders writes about a certain belief. You have the sphere of the political, and that's where it must be dealt with. But he says, belief today, in the age of the unbounded, one could treat facts as purely political, even as purely tactical. In discussing them, one could confine oneself to staying within the bounds of this area of competence of the political, which is supposedly neatly separated from other areas. This belief is not only limited, but it also actually defines today's limitedness. If top men in politics today take special pride in publicly displaying this defect, even flaunting it in a conservative Biedermeier-like fashion, it is probably because they are too limited to get an idea of how their limitations are handled and what the consequences are. An outstanding sentence follows then. The greatness of stupidity is always proportional to the greatness of the unseen consequences. End of quote. And this is what Oppenheimer is confronted with. and what we are confronted with as spectators. The functionaries of the government and the Secret Service are not able to think of another world with Niels Bohr. They are trapped in the rules of a deadly competition, and that's why they can't let up. They must keep arming and arming. Once again, Günther Anders, he speaks of the accumulated lack of inhibition in the accumulation of power. Quote, the greater the power in one's hands, the less one is inhibited from using it. This law is rooted in the fact of the prophetic gradient, in the fact that we as imaginers are not equal to what we ourselves can produce and employ, that effects lose more inconceivability the greater they become. That, for example, one has fewer inhibitions about liquidating 100 people across the board than killing one. End of quote. Not only Oppenheimer despairs of this, but Nolan enables us to despair of it too. It is a very bitter film, but it also ponders, what does a biopic consist of? Have all perspectives been considered? And Nolan is honest enough to say you can't see everything. And he shows it in a concrete manner. Louis Oppenheimer and many other men sit at a table after World War II discussing the hydrogen bomb, what to do now, how to talk with the Soviets, should we talk with the Soviets? A large bouquet of flowers is situated in the middle of the table, and you can see never everyone sitting at the table, as this bouquet of flowers always covers something. And that's why it's always moved a little bit. But if you move it to the left, to the right, then you can't see another face. The view is obstructed. And in fact, that's what Oppenheimer has, what is Oppenheimer's problem. The Japanese, it turned out later, were quite open to peace. The bomb was an option, but it was not, as Oppenheimer was told, absolutely necessary. But Oppenheimer was not told about it. He could not see the whole picture. Something obstructed his view, the interest of the state. And we have known about the state since Nietzsche. The state is called coldest of all cold monsters. A novelty with Nolan, as he is known as a patriotic director, take the Batman trilogy. But now there is a lot of skepticism. Einstein knows the state keeps humiliating the individual, and at some point it grants one a medal. Admittedly, we can hear Oppenheimer say beforehand, "I love America," but Oppenheimer believes in his necessity for America far too long. Yes, he is still needed, he is told, but in the end, skepticism prevails. The interests of the state are not identical with the interests of the people, even if the ideologues of patriotism claim so. Christopher Nolan has made a fascinating, very bitter film, even if the camera approaches the characters in all the close-ups. As soon as they act as functionaries, we can no longer trust them. And that's why the only two relevant female characters stand out so much among all these men, because males completely dominate the Manhattan Project, like the McCarthy era. The women, Kitty Oppenheimer, played by Emily Blunt, and Jean Tedlock, played by Florence Pugh, Oppenheimer's affair. These women are not actors in the service of the state, and that's why we can trust them, just as we can trust those who remain external, Niels Bohr and Einstein. With all the others, we can never be sure whether we are watching or seeing. It would be nice if you would like to support the film analysis financially. You can do so via my bank account or PayPal. Also, you can find me on Patreon. Thank you very much.